Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We've got a lot ready to talk about for you on the second episode of the week, coming off our latest look at Penn State football practice. We're not far off from our next one, too. That's going to be next Tuesday. So really learning a lot about the Nittany Lions. Excited to bring a lot of our notebook to you here at Lions247 Podcast, encouraging everyone that's listening and not currently subscribed to our site to maybe reconsider the way you take on Penn State football information, take on your Penn State football content, because from here on out, we are just going to have a steady stream of that at Lions247.com. And right now, that 50% offer is still going, 50% off VIP access for a full year at Lions247.com. That's less than 17 cents per day. So highly encourage you to take a look at that deal over at Lions247.com, because there's a ton of stuff we just won't have time to get to on these podcast episodes that we are going to be going into in depth on a daily basis over at the website. But without further ado, let's bring in Daniel Gallen, who I know is fresh off doing a bunch of Friday morning posts over at Lions247 for our VIP subscribers regarding some things we're learning about running backs and offensive line. Daniel, all of a sudden the floodgates are open. Last Saturday, we were in Penn State facilities back in Beaver Stadium, got a chance to hear from James Franklin, a bunch of players. It was media day. We reviewed a lot of that with our Tuesday episode of this podcast. Tyler Calvaruso hopped on to help break down some of the early freshman buzz too. But here we are off our second look at practice. You and I kind of swapped positions on the field. You watched offense for practice number 2 after watching a defense last Saturday. I'm the reverse, and you had Mark Brennan roaming around the field and Grace Brennan with their cameras and providing the multimedia content over on the site. But as I said, 4 days from now, we're back there again, and we're starting to be able to put the pieces together, start to learn the depth chart. And again, really impressive, the talent level that we're seeing, just really every corner of the field right now. And you understand why when outside national people come through like Big Ten Network, they leave saying this is the best looking Penn State team they've seen in a couple decades, because I'd imagine it's quite true. Mark Brennan's been telling us that for a while now.
Yeah, I think you look across the field and you just feel really good about what you're seeing out there. I know we've talked about it a couple times where this roster just feels so strong. There's not too many positions where you look at them and you raise your eyebrows or say, I don't know. I think we'll talk about a couple of those spots in a little bit where maybe you could do that. But it just seems like very top to bottom that you've got a lot of guys that are proven, who have done a lot of different things at the college level, and you're seeing them take these steps forward and move into pretty significant roles for Penn State. So yeah, I mean, two looks at them. Obviously it's going to be completely different when we get to August 30th and it's Nevada out there. Even though it's just Nevada, like that's still something completely different for these guys. But I think where we are right now, Friday, August 8th, I mean, you feel good and you don't see anything that makes you think like, I don't really know about this preseason hype.
There weren't a lot of major differences between the team we saw last Saturday and the team we saw on Thursday, which you like to see. Contact is intensifying. More pads are coming on. You're going to see more violence on the field. That's the nature of the sport. And yet James Franklin is feeling like they're kind of working in reverse of how you usually experience preseason camp. He thinks that they're getting more guys involved, healthier, because they had limited guys going into camp. They wanted to see what they could do when the pads came on before they could clear them for contact. Seems like there's been good progression in that regard. Of course, I'll knock on wood for everybody listening. By the time we get to Tuesday, you never know what it looks like. Again, the nature of the sport, but in a pretty good shape from a health standpoint. What was much different, though, is when you were watching defense last Saturday, you saw defensive end Nittany White working under Deion Barnes' supervision. When I watched defense on Thursday, I saw defensive tackle Nittany White working with Barnes and his defensive line staff. And that is a bit of news that came out of Thursday's practice. I camped over in the corner there, the defensive field, spent much of the time monitoring the defensive ends and defensive tackles who were split apart into those position groups during drill work. And 45, Nittany White was with the defensive tackles for all 6 of those periods that we were able to watch. One of our colleagues, Max, was able to ask James Franklin if he didn't, I was going to do it. And we learned, yes, this is a permanent change for them. This wasn't just something they were fiddling with on the practice field. Nittany White, who's now at 275 pounds, will be playing defensive tackle. Will he be playing in games? Will it just be kind of a practice experience for him in 2025? That's to be determined. But Daniel, this is notable because we had really heard nothing regarding buzz of him pushing for too deep consideration at defensive end. He showed up at Texas A&M in 2022 as a 230-pound top 100 prospect out of Philadelphia. That was his most productive season when you really look at the statistics and his usage, about 90 defensive snaps. But then he tears his ACL in October of 2023. He only gets involved for one game last season coming off that injury. It was during a blowout win over New Mexico State. So he's not even out there playing SEC football for the Aggies. And so there were already a lot of questions about this. Now here he is, 45 or so pounds heavier than that last time we saw him get any kind of extended run on a college field in games. And James Franklin, the line that he gave us is he feels like this is a move that is the most beneficial to prolong his football career on one hand. And he also says it's the move that's most beneficial to this current Penn State defense. So I don't think any of us are going to, insert him as a too deep defensive tackle right off the jump. Let's give this some time. Let's gain some feedback. But right off the cuff, what do you think about this move for Penn State and for Nittany White?
It's an interesting move, especially when you consider following Nittany White's physical progress since he got to Penn State. On that last roster update, he popped up at 275 pounds, which I think caught a lot of people's eyes. Franklin said that it wasn't really that hard for him to put on that weight. And so, that at Penn State, they're doing it the right way. I know it's come up on our board a little bit, and we've talked about it privately, like both Nittany White and TJ Shanahan coming over from Texas A&M, and the immediate feedback from Chuck Losey and others being that there's a lot of rework that needed to be done to get them up to speed with how Penn State does things. So I just think for Nittany White, he did kind of come in as a little bit of a blank slate for them to work with. Like, he has not played a lot of college football. At this point, you're 4 years removed from that lofty high school ranking. He's someone that can come in and you can figure things out a little bit with him. I know that you look at that defensive end depth, and it would have been nice if he could come in and you were immediately like, oh, okay, he's competing to be that number 3, number 4 guy. At the same time, given the way that they recruited and some of the depth that's there, you'd like to see a little bit more. Like, it's not a huge blow to not have that happen. So I think this is just Penn State looking at a player, looking at their roster situation, and trying to find something that can work out best for both of them.
I think, yeah. I was sorry, Daniel, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off there.
I was going to say, and I mean, it's going to be interesting competition there at defensive tackle because you have a lot of young guys that I think that you should be excited about. And Franklin has already he's already singled out those top 5. So we'll see what Nittany White can do, maybe what he can do differently than other people that are in that room, and go from there.
James Franklin talked about how your athleticism tends to stand out a bit more. You move to the interior. He's discussed that in the past with some guys who have made a move from the edge to the defensive tackle situation. And at 275, there's more room to grow there. And James Franklin says it really hasn't been a conscious effort where they've been trying to pile on the pounds for him. It's really just been something that has occurred within the program. And so now Chuck Losey, you're trying to build a defensive tackle. I'd imagine that by the time we get to the end of the season, certainly the next spring, Nittany White's going to physically look different. And let's remember, he's down to his last 2 seasons of college eligibility. So that clock is ticking a bit in his head. And I think there was some sense maybe on our board and as I saw some reaction on social media, that this maybe had something to do with just those young defensive ends who we'll get to in a moment are just too good to keep off the field. So Nittany White's got to find somewhere else to play. I don't think this is about finding Nittany White a role in September 2025. I think this is about getting Nittany White to the finish line of his college career with your program and feeling good about both parties that you did what you could to maximize his time here and within your defense, but also to set him up where maybe he's got some film and he's got some experience where he can show enough versatility where an NFL team maybe reconsiders what he looked like through his first 3 years on a college campus. There's just really not much out there for him. So I would make this more about a Nittany White situation than I would about this entire Penn State defense. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of the read personally.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think that this is Penn State trying to do right by the player. while also something that could benefit, the program itself down the road.
Let's talk about defensive tackle, because clearly you've got one of the best in the country leading the way, senior Zane Durant. It's also becoming increasingly clear that Alonzo Ford, back to full health after an injury that kept him off the field during the playoffs and during spring ball. He's likely going to be that second guy next to Zane Durant for much of these matchups, or maybe early in these matchups. Big time run stopper. We had a piece during our preseason progress report series over at Lions247 for our VIP subscribers, breaking down some feedback we've gotten early in preseason camp about what Ford has been able to accomplish, what he has shown, and particularly his emphasis as a run stopper. But Xavier Gilliam continues to surge as a redshirt freshman. James Franklin addressing, yes, there has been some buzz around this young man. Ty Blanding, he said, is as twitchy and as athletic as anyone they have at the position. Blanding now a redshirt sophomore. So those two guys figuring to factor into the top 4 or 5. And he also made it a point, as he has done in recent weeks, to say Owen Wafel, the transfer pickup last year from Michigan, now a redshirt freshman, he's ready to get out there and probably play for us. So that brings us to about 5. I believe these match with the 5 that he brought to the table out in Las Vegas during Media Day, Daniel. And he said it's a bunch of guys battling for those 5th and 6th spots. You look out in the field, I think he brought up some of these names, but Liam Andrews in his second year on campus, Randy Adarica, first year in town. One guy that was missing from our look at practice, unfortunately, it's been kind of a common theme for his career, was Caleb Artis, a big-bodied redshirt junior, not on the field when we looked and not brought up when James Franklin was asked about defensive tackle depth. So read into that what you will. But Daniel, it certainly seems that Blanding, Wafel, and then Gilliam, which is no surprise at this point, are those 3 guys really ready, waiting in the wings. And we could probably see a lot of them in non-conference play beyond those 2 established seniors in Alonzo Ford and Zane Durant.
Definitely. I think that this group is going to be really intriguing when we go through that non-conference slate. Who's the 3rd guy who rotates in, what kind of pairings that they use, all those different things. I think Ty Blanding is someone that is, going back to the blue-white game in the spring, is someone that I think I'm trying to be more cognizant of. I know that last year, it was down the stretch, it was all Gilliam as kind of the next guy up. But I think with what Blanding did in the blue-white game, and then he didn't make the freaks list from Bruce Feldman at The Athletic, but Blanding was brought up as a guy that, can do some really, really, unusual things athletically at his size. And I think that that's, another data point that you put in the back of your head, because, someone's only making that list. It takes a little bit of promotion to end up on that list. And it means that that's something that people want out there. They want people to know that Ty Blanding is this type of athlete. So that caught my eye a little bit. And then I think Owen Wafel, he is another one of those on the shorter side, but defensive tackles. But he just looked like in the blue-white game like such a good space eater, and I've seen that a little bit more in the looks at practice. So I think that you've got this group of 5 guys that you can really mix and match. Obviously, Durant and Ford are the 2 guys that you want to ride, especially when you think about competing for a national championship. But if you can get some of these guys in different situations, mix and match a little bit, do some different things, I think that can bode really well for this group. It's the thing where Durant and Ford are really the only proven guys that you have, and you are relying on potential. You are putting a little bit of faith in these other 3 guys to embrace this moment and step up. But I do think that you should feel good about where this group is right now.
Wafel's like 6'2", compact, really solidly built guy.
Looks like a rectangle out there.
I mean, I was going to say that, quite frankly, I was going to say that exact phrase. So we're on the same page, but then I'm reminded of like what he looked like as a recruit, what he did. And at that point, he was already in the 290 to high 280s range at 6'2", toward the tail end of his recruitment. He was running 4.8 in the 40-yard dash. He was dunking the basketball on the court. And I know that Michigan staff fell in love with so many of his athletic traits. And I know people who covered that program closely were a bit surprised that he departed the program so early, because they thought maybe he would be part of those plans for the future. But now it seems like quickly he's inserted himself into the conversation here with Penn State. Credit to him, a guy that has not played in college action. If he's healthy, if he's available, I think that's going to change on August 30th at some point during the opener, and we'll start to figure out what this defensive tackle group looks like. Speaking of figuring things out, with Nittany White removed from the equation, there's a lot of names that we thought were going to be part of the defensive end plan back in like January that simply are not part of the equation. Max Grenville's injured. Smith Filbert's down in Chapel Hill. Amin Vandover's chasing his dream at the next level. And so all of a sudden, that spotlight is growing on these young pieces of the room for Deion Barnes. And that includes a young man who just showed up to campus this summer, and he's got about a week of practices now. We wrote about him a bunch in our preseason progress series. Chaz Coleman. I mean, this guy, he pops off the field to you before they even get in any kind of functional movement drills. If they're standing around, you're wondering, okay, where does that guy play on the field? Like, what position is he? That's the first thing. He's not wiry. He's pretty well filled out with 6'5", 240 pounds right now, somewhere in that range. But the length is remarkable. You remember he was running routes last season. He was playing quarterback for his high school squad. And you also remember that Ohio State and Larry Johnson badly wanted this kid to be a Buckeye as a freshman right now. And Penn State pushed them off, got him to campus. And I'm telling you, Daniel, you see him standing alongside Ivan Kamaju, who is basically built like a Y, not like a rectangle. He's built like a Y, which is great because his name starts with one. And there's so much potential that he is already flashing on the field, and he's been doing it since the weight room in January. And then you throw in some of these other pieces. I thought even Daniel Jennings fit in pretty well. He's pushing toward 250 as a reclassified freshman. And a guy that kind of caught my attention, and we've heard a little bit about his speed off the edge, is Cortez Harris. I don't think he's at 230 yet. He might be pushing toward that way. But there's a springy nature to the way he navigates the football field. I know you were watching this group last week. They're a little less green maybe at this point. They're on practice 7 instead of practice 3 of preseason camp. But some of these guys got to step up and look by look, conversation by conversation. I'm beginning to gain the confidence that because of what they have with this kind of ramp up with non-conference play and the reps they should be able to attribute to some of these guys, that Deion Barnes is going to figure this thing out. As long as he's got Denai, Dennis Sutton, and Zariah Fisher available at the top of this depth chart, able to be those accountable starters and let these guys make some mistakes along the way, he's got the goods. That's without even getting to some of those second-year players. Jalen Harvey among that group stands out to me, but I really like the youngest pieces of this puzzle, and I think you could see a couple of them threaten to burn red shirt by mid to late October.
I think when thinking about these freshmen and how they can contribute, I do wonder if we could see something similar to like what we did with Quentin Martin and Corey Smith last year, where they were managed in a way that like you knew you were going to get 8 regular season games out of them. And so you just, treated them as like one person pretty much in terms of, who had what week when someone was going to contribute. That's something that I've been thinking about a little bit in terms of trying to figure out how ready someone is. And I know that Franklin talks about it a lot, where when it comes to the eligibility and the red shirts, like they really do want to do right by these kids in terms of what is best for the team right now, but also their future, their development. With Chaz Coleman, I mean, you talk about the cliche about guys getting off the bus and looking the part and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, he looks like he belongs in that room. He fits in perfectly. I think that you could point at him and tell someone that he was a 3rd or 4th year guy, and they would believe you if they weren't familiar. He looks that part. I think that when we get to the end of the month and the non-conference game starts, he's going to be one that when we on our Thursday afternoon pods and we're singling guys out that we're excited to see, I think we're all going to be fighting over him, depending on the order there. I think that's pretty exciting. And, and he just has those athletic traits. I mean, we heard so much about his basketball background, the different things he did on the football field. I think he has the potential to be a really unique player for you on the defensive side. I think Cortez Harris is maybe a guy that, I changed my perception a little bit, seeing him in person, seeing him on the field. I watched his highlight tape. I'm no Tyler Calvaruso when it comes to watching those things, but you look at the tape, what he was able to do, and then you look at his measurements and you think about what it takes to play at this level, play in the Big Ten, and you're kind of like, okay, like I think he was listed in the 200s on signing day. now up in the 220s. But looking at him, you can see the pieces that are there, and you can see where he can fill out, where he can continue to develop, and you can see the projection a little bit there. He's someone that I think that I'm not going to say like I feel better about him now, because I think that takes away from him a little bit. But it's the thing that we talk about where you want to see these guys on the field. You want to see him standing next to a Denai Dennis Sutton and a Zane Durant, two guys that belong, to give you an idea of where these guys stand. And seeing Cortez Harris in that group, I think that it's a little more like, okay, like I can see it, you can project it a little bit more right now.
I think where my head's at is I love what Deion Barnes came up with at the end of, by the end of that recruiting class in 2025. This was a class that he could really sink his teeth into more, got to know these guys as high school juniors, got to really figure out the pecking order, who he was going to target, suffered some heartbreak, missing on some key targets, but I love the group of edge rushers that he brought to campus. And Deshaun Burnett's another guy in that group, Malachi Williams. I think you make a great point. Some of these guys already have a red shirt, but maybe you could spread 3 freshman defensive ends across 12 games, and whoever really flashes to you, then you can let them be unleashed a bit in some kind of special role in the postseason. Who can maybe earn their way into that role? That's going to be a question mark, but I think there's a good chance because of the depth chart and because of what they lack, beyond Denai and beyond Zariah, that there's going to have to be some burned red shirts. I still believe Ivan Kamaju is the top dog in that conversation, but paying much closer attention these days to some of those other newcomers in the defensive end room. And look, you want to talk about positional depth chart intrigue. There's plenty of it on the offensive line. You were watching that group closely on Thursday evening. Tell us a little bit about what stood out to you, because it just feels like we can list 15 names and they all might end up being part of that game one plan.
Yeah, I think the thing that stood out to me the most in terms of what we could see on August 30th in terms of where guys are lining up was that Anthony Donko was working with the guards. I know that that's something that we've talked about and has been floated out there about the potential of him playing right guard and competing with Cooper Cousins for that spot, with Nolan Rucci at right tackle. They split the groups up, so they had the tackles working on in one area, the guards and interior guys in another, and Donko was over with the guards, Rucci over with the tackles. So I think that was a little bit of clarity there. I know that I was a little bit more kind of like slow playing, like the idea of Donko competing for that right guard spot, just because he was so good at right tackle last year and he won that job. But I think now we can see a little bit more of Phil Trautwein's thinking. After practice, he said that he wants to get the best 5 out there, which is definitely a common thing that we've heard from him. And he said, is that Donka at right guard, Rucci at right tackle? Is that Donka at right tackle and then Cooper Cousins or TJ Shanahan or Alex Birchmeier or Chimdi Ono or Javen Williams at right guard? Like that's what they're going to do. But yeah, I mean, I think you look at that group and ton of guys out there and a ton of different combinations for Trautwein to really work through, especially over on that right side. I think that center and the left side, we kind of know what the deal is there.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun to follow and in that kind of left tackle number 2 job, because we just love some of these young bodies and some of these young prospects out in the field who could step up next year. But Drew Shelton's not going anywhere. But again, there might be, like 5-6 quarters of work for some of these guys through the first few games. We hate to keep being like, these will be 3 blowouts. This team will be 3-0 with a bunch of points scored and very little allowed. But that's what should happen early in the schedule, and we should get a longer look at a bunch of these dudes. I want to know, TJ Shanahan was getting some reps at right guard when I saw the offensive line move over across the field for some work against the defense. But you also picked up something with Javen Williams, a former 5-star prospect, guy who got a lot of work at right tackle this spring with Rucci and Donko unavailable in recovery, and now focused on the interior and now also dealing with a bit of a challenge.
Sorry. I think with Javen Williams, with moving him over. Sorry, I got a spam call right there. To pull back the curtain for everyone on a great Friday morning. I think with Javen Williams, moving around, trying to find a home for him, it's a really interesting piece in there. When you talk about him being, him being that 5-star, him being that guy that, we've seen rep at a lot of different spots. Phil Troutline after practice talked about, in the spring, he got a ton of reps at right tackle because of the Donka and Rucci situation. But now, they get to move him at guard so that they can make sure that he can be ready to do that when the time comes. And it puts a ton of bodies there. When Troutline was running through all those guys who could play at right guard, it's like between Ono, Birchmeyer, and Williams, you've got 3 top 24/7 recruits from that same class, and everyone that is working in there. So I think that you see these younger guys come in, and they raise the level of competition, and guys that are going into their third year are really competing for spots and fighting right there.
Yeah. Well, the additional challenge I mentioned, I thought you were picking up on, was the fact that he was wearing a club on his hand at practice, at least because you passed that along to me. I didn't see it myself. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. It's, man, there's so much just seeing all these guys and,
I know,
trying to notice every little thing. I was going through like the Phil Troutline audio this morning, and there's all these little nuggets. Like Egan Boyer is 300 pounds now. That was Phil Troutline said that finally happened yesterday.
Let me remind people real quick. He was 238 when he showed up in January 2024. 238 pounds at 6'8". So get him a big cake and celebrate 300.
Yeah. So there's just so many different nuggets and trying to learn these guys. One guy that looking out there. We can talk about Malachi Goodman in a second, but even looking at like Owen Alasine, he's someone that I liked what he did in the blue-white game. And then looking at him, I think he's listed at like 284 pounds at 6'7", but he is just so put together physically. And it's the thing where, he played hockey in high school, and he does have that kind of look of just that tall, intimidating, hockey defenseman, like a Zdeno Chara, just that type of big guy. So every time you look at this group, something different pops. And so I guess at this point in the year, I only have room in my head for so many things. And Javen Williams' club got the boot this morning.
I will note, not Cooper Cousins is a guy that's, seemingly, he's got to battle to get in the starting lineup. I think a lot of us thought he would, be there, and we kind of thought it would be the case. And then you're seeing some mixing and matching here. I saw him absolutely truck Alonzo Ford. We don't get a lot of live action, of contact between linemen like this, where you get a running back and linebackers involved. But there was like half offensive line set with a tight end and then a running back, and then they were going up against a couple of defensive linemen and a linebacker. And Alonzo Ford, we've heard a lot of good things about his run stopping. He was not stopping Cooper Cousins. He got bulldozed, and I just think Cooper Cousins, on a few reps that I saw, not only was he just intense with his physical action, he was like staring down the defensive line group. He was shouting things at them. And so this is a guy who is on a mission. He is, every time we see him, he seems to be hyper-focused. But I haven't really been able to see up close and personal in the practice field that violent nature of Cooper Cousins that we hear so much about. And that was pretty cool to pick up in the flesh, because he's great to deal with. He's a pretty gentle giant, I think, when he interacts with civilian life. But with defensive linemen, even when they're wearing, that Penn State uniform, he's not having it. And I picked up on that a little bit out there on the field. So it'd be really fascinating to see this first 5 hour. And as we said, don't get attached to that first 5, because the next series or the third series, you could see a different 5, and then you could see that on series number 5 too. So it'll be fun to follow more from Troutline and more on a lot of this offensive line takeaways. I know you loved what you saw at Malachi Goodman, as I did last week, a former 5-star. There's a lot to get into on the offensive line. It can run. It's like a runaway train with this podcast. We can invest half the show into talking about the O-line. We got other places to get to. So if you're good,
I do have one more Egan Boyer thing that Troutline said that when he camped, he ran the 40 in 4.84 at Troutline said 241 pounds, and then when he was up at 287, he also ran 4.84. So I think that kind of just shows the type of athlete he is and the type of work that Penn State is putting into these players.
Yeah, that is not normal. But good for Egan Boyer, and a guy that, again, come 2026, I think we'll be talking about him quite a bit more, but he should also get some opportunities here this season behind Drew Shelton. Over at RB3, a spot that we've been watching closely for a while now, behind Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen, who we'll circle back to in a moment. But between picking James Franklin's brain a bit on the subject and then getting a chance to hear from Stan Drayton immediately after Thursday's practice, I feel like we're in a better spot now to have this conversation about what actually is happening in that battle. It's 5 scholarship guys representing 3 different classes. You've got Cam Wallace as the oldest of that group as a redshirt sophomore, and then 2 true freshmen on campus. What stood out to you? Because you just documented a lot of what Drayton said over at our site. What did you take away as best you could reading between the lines? Because I asked Drayton directly, do you have a timeline for figuring this out? He said, if I could figure it out today, I'd do it. My job would be easier. It's just that's not what it is. He's waiting to see these guys stack it up.
Yeah, that was my biggest takeaway from that was a good question for him. And I think that it's that question where just when do you want to know this by? For any position at this point in the year, I think that it can be illuminating for us. And I think it was with Drayton. And he said he wished he knew today, that he wished that there would be a guy that would pretty much just step up and really seize that job. But he said that the consistency hasn't been there yet. He had really good things to say about each of these 5 players behind Singleton and Allen individually. But he also said that collectively that he wants to see more consistency for them, that you're not seeing guys, stack back to back days on the practice field. And so I think that reading between the lines there could be something that we see extend into the season a little bit, or maybe it's a little bit more matchup dependent, those types of things, game plan dependent of which of these running backs that you're going to use. But I mean, I think the overall fact that stood out to me is that Drayton really likes this group and had a lot of praise for them. And I think he realizes that he has some talent, guys that can do different things. And I'm really excited to see how they deploy them with Andy Kotelnicki's offense, with Stan Drayton managing that room now.
James Franklin talked about the recovery process for Cam Wallace, not just being physical, but being mental and emotional. It was a really ugly injury situation for him. I want to emphasize that what took place last year, game 3. He was RB3 at the time, scores a touchdown against Penn State, but he finishes that game in a really scary situation on his way to the hospital. He's back on the field by the end of spring, but they feel like right now, day by day, he's letting a lot of that past go. And which is so important coming off of an injury. And he's starting to look more like the Cam Wallace who won this RB3 job last year. They got a few more scrimmages to come. They had their first earlier this week in Beaver Stadium. I think that's going to tell the tale for a lot of where this running back conversation goes. But it's good to hear that feedback on Cam Wallace. And what we continue to hear about Quentin Martin, a former top 24/7 prospect, a guy who was on Penn State's radar for his whole high school career, now a redshirt freshman. When you bring his name up, it's also about what he can do for you on special teams. It's also about what he can do for you as a receiving threat. And he's probably near that top of my list and guys who we don't expect to see start, Daniel. But I'm very curious to see how Andy Kotelnicki utilizes them, because he's going to know he has a finite amount of snaps for certain players. And I think Quentin Martin is one of them. So where does he put him on the field? How does he look to get the ball to him? Because I think that he's the kind of OC who's going to try to facilitate opportunities for a talent like Quentin Martin. I don't think this guy's just going to wait for Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen to come to the sideline and get his turn. I think there are spots of a game and spots of possessions where you can pop this guy in the field.
Yeah, we saw them try to do that a little bit last year. I think Quentin Martin had 1 snap in that USC game, and it was it was a triple option play, very clearly that was manufactured for him to be in the field in that spot. I guess part of whatever package of plays that he had. So I'm interested to see how that expands in year 2. I did think that probably the most promising feedback that you get from Stan Drayton about Quentin Martin is that, and Drayton said it was a question mark for him too, was how Martin could run between the tackles. We know that he's a little bit taller, 6'1". He's on the lankier side. He looks different from all the other running backs in that room physically. And so for Drayton to say that, he's seeing him to be able to, do contact, to go in there and, put his head down, run between the tackles, get that pad level low, and go through. I think that bodes well for Martin's future, because that's something that you're going to have to do if you want to play in the Big Ten, if you want to play college football. Like, it can't be purely gadget plays all the time if you want to be an every down running back. So I think that was one big positive about Martin that I took away from Drayton last night.
Over at Lions247.com, Daniel has you covered with VIP notes on a lot of commentary from Drayton on every single one of these competitors in the running back room. Kind of bullet points for you real quick, though. He called Corey Smith, the other redshirt freshman, the most elusive guy in this room. He said he'll make you miss in a phone booth. And we saw Corey Smith, get out for some big runs at a couple different points in Big Ten action last year in a way that Quentin Martin was not able to do. And then he talked about Jabri Coleman, showing up and maybe not being where he needs to be physically to be a piece of Penn State's offensive plans quite yet. But it sounds like he's kind of hit the ground running. He's trying, he didn't have the head start of Tyke Hayes, who showed up to campus for the playoff practices and was around for spring ball. He got here in the summer. He didn't put on shoulder pads until Saturday. But I got a quick look at Jabri Coleman. Is out of Philadelphia, that MOTEP program that we talked about a bunch with some of these recent cycles. He had a really beautiful jump cut that put him into the open field, allowed him to burst through some defenders there. And he got an immediate shout out from James Franklin from a few yards away. That was my introduction to Jabri on the practice field. I later saw him. He is a guy that, enter him into the conversation. Why not? We'll see. He's got some ground to make up, like I said, but I think he's the kid who looked like he showed up from a lot of different ways, ready to go out there and look like he belonged. And no one in that group right now looks like they don't belong. And sometimes you wonder, will both the freshmen be ready? I think they're both ready. I think Jabri Coleman is probably, as they say, drinking out of the water hose right now. But 5 guys, I'm going to give them all a chance to see game action. I like Tyke Hayes out of that freshman group more, but it's hard to discount anybody long-term when we look down to November, December about who could factor in behind the 2 seniors.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I liked about the feedback that we got from Drayton was that it was positives, but also things that he wants to see guys work on. Like he said, Corey Smith didn't have the best scrimmage last weekend. He talked about having questions about Quentin Martin running between the tackles. He said that Jabri Coleman came in at 213 pounds, but doesn't necessarily have the functional strength that he needs right now to play at this level. So I think we got a pretty, clear-eyed look at the running back room. I did like the feedback on Jabri Coleman because, he is someone that I think that, as the summer enrollee and given the up and down of his recruitment a little bit, that he never really had the chance that some of these guys, freshmen, get when they come in, where it really builds the excitement, whether that's when they commit, what their senior season is like, or they get here in the spring and we start hearing a lot about them. So I think Coleman
would say this, Daniel. A running back out of Philadelphia who was previously committed to the national champion Georgia Bulldogs at the time ends up in Happy Valley at this position. We know what they say about the best in the state, staying in the state. And you're right. It was about as quiet in terms of hype as any freshman arrival here in 2025. Great point.
Yeah. And so I think that, and it's also too, we were talking about the summer enrollees. I know that it's like human nature a little bit too, to discount those guys a little bit, just because we know how much of a leg up being here for the spring and enrolling in January can give you. But I think to hear those things about Jabri Coleman, it was a really good scouting report to get right now. One more thing on Corey Smith was that Drayton was talking about his pass protection, that he's the smallest back in the room, but he's starting to show some toughness there. We got to see some reps of the 3 freshman linebackers, LeVar Arrington, Alex Taish, and Cam Smith, rushing the passer and the running backs having to block them. LeVar Arrington had a couple good reps, including one against Katron Allen, but there was one play where Corey Smith just completely planted Alex Taish, and that's someone that physically, I really like how that linebacker looks. I think he looks like he belongs out there, but seeing that from across the field, just Corey Smith, make that contact and finish that rep. All that stuff's going to be evaluated. It's not just the fact that he can break off an 80-yard run. He's got to be able to stand in there and give that quarterback that extra split second. So it's an interesting room, and I think it's going to be fun to see when guys get rotated in, who we're picking every Friday to break off a long run in garbage time for a touchdown, and see how it all shakes out.
Smith, I believe, now listed at 193. Last year he was 179, I think, on the roster. So making some strides there. And the cool thing about the conversation with Stan Drayton yesterday was that he didn't recruit any of these guys to campus. None of these are his projects. These are all, inherited, and he's doing the best he can with the group. And it's a hell of a group to inherit. But he does have kind of this, like you said, clear-eyed, probably a little more unbiased look of evaluating than a guys that he was invested in their living room at 16 years old and doing everything he could to get them to campus and selling the coaching staff on why they were fits. These are the guys that he showed up to campus and they were ready to practice with him. And that includes Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. And probably among a lot of what Stan Drayton said, people will focus on what he said about the running backs we don't know much about. But there were some interesting nuggets to glean from what he said about the two guys we've seen play a bunch of football in a Nittany Lions uniform.
Yeah, going back to the spring when Stan Drayton got hired and got started working with these guys, I think a lot of the questions for him about Singleton and Allen have kind of been like, well, like what is left for you to to teach these guys, because they've both essentially been 3-year starters through their first 3 years on campus. They've played so much football. Ja'Juan Seider was really well regarded as a running backs coach, and you saw improvement under him. And so you're kind of like going into year 4, like what's left for these guys? And I think from an intangible perspective, Drayton said that he wants to see them be a little bit more vocal as leaders, that in their small group settings, and he said that we might not see it necessarily when they're on the practice field, that they are vocal, they are being mentors for these younger running backs, but he wants to see more of it. And we both know that Allen and Singleton are both more on the quiet side, just from our interactions with them in the media settings. But I did think that was really interesting from Drayton, was that he was asked about anything in particular that he wanted to see Allen and Singleton take steps in, and he said that the instincts are there, but not necessarily the understanding of what they're doing. And basically Drayton's point was that they can react at a high level, they can do all these different things on the field, but he wants them to anticipate now. And so part of that is, his quote is, quote, "In order to do that, you got to learn defense. You got to understand how your formation is going to set a defense, or how that defense is going to fit that formation. You got to understand linebacker flow. You got to understand indicators and pass protection. All that stuff was not developed. So they had a huge learning curve as far as that's going." And he said that he wants to see the game slow down for them. And it is starting to slow down. So I think that was really interesting to me, because we know that physically both of those running backs, they're very different, but are in that elite tier, just the different things that they can do. And I think it goes into what some of the feedback this spring that we heard on Singleton was that we want him to get start hitting more home runs, to get past that last defender, to get to the safety. And I think that part of that is knowing how to get there. It's just not being able to get there. It's knowing all the little things that one thing leads to another, and then suddenly you can be in the clear. I thought that was just a really interesting piece of feedback from Drayton, and a nice level of honesty, I think, in terms of evaluating players at this stage of their career who have done the things that Singleton and Allen have done.
And I certainly wonder a little bit how maybe these comments land in South Bend, Indiana, if they make it out there after 3 years of Ja'Juan Seider being involved in their development, and for Drayton to suggest that there's that much room for growth in those departments. It'll be, if they get to another level from where they have been, and it's notable, and Stan Drayton's at the helm, boy, will this look like a hell of a pickup. I know that Jim Knowles is getting the national buzz right now, but Stan Drayton, what he's accomplished, we've gone over it this offseason. He's got college football Hall of Famers, first-round draft picks on his resume as a running backs coach. If he takes these guys to a different level, it's going to mean a lot for this offense. It's going to mean a lot for their NFL draft stock, and it'll be really fascinating to see what happens next for the running back room, especially in recruiting. But when it comes to the receiver group, there is a nice little swell of talent that we've talked about beyond those transfers who are going to get the spotlight all season long. But we're wondering, are some of those young pieces primed to step up? We've talked about Tyseer Denmark last year. We've talked about him increasingly this year, but he didn't break through last year in the way that we thought he might. Could someone burn that red shirt? Could someone step up as a year 2 player and go play 12 games for this team over the course of the regular season? And 3 names came up when James Franklin was asked about progress reports on that receiver room from the young players. And those 3, Josiah Brown, Jeff Exeter Jr., and Kobe Howard. I'm not going to say that these are the guys who are at the very top of the conversation, but they're just the 3 that James Franklin navigated toward when he wanted to get in that conversation. And he said Jeff Exeter Jr., big physical guy, tested extremely well, ran extremely well when he showed up this summer. So you match up what already looks like maybe the biggest wide receiver in this room as a true freshman who just got to campus, and he's also got this speed that's impressing the staff. Yeah, there's a really nice situation developing for Jeff Exeter Jr. out of the McDonough School in Maryland. Josiah Brown last year came to campus coming off an injury that cost him his senior season of high school. We didn't get to see any of him in game action last year. James Franklin says he's currently, quote, playing lightning fast. And then the other name, no surprise, this one will come up, but Kobe Howard, freshman out of Florida. He's been on campus since last winter. Probably the guy that we've gravitated toward most on the offensive side of the ball in terms of burning red shirt this year. He says he's the guy that's gotten a lot of buzz early in camp. And so there's a buzz inside team facilities. There's a buzz outside team facilities when it comes to Howard. But the references to Josiah Brown and then Jeff Exeter Jr., I'll give Tyler Cavaruso some credit. You know, a couple of weeks before we got into preseason camp, he put him in his top 5 list of potential impact freshmen. He wasn't really on my radar in that kind of a way. Then I saw him for myself last Saturday, and I started to put a foot on that bandwagon. Then James Franklin brings him up in our conversation on Thursday, puts some public light on the conversation, and I'm starting to think, okay, there's a few guys in this receiver room that we got to start paying more attention to.
Yeah, Exeter, it goes back to what I said about Jabri Coleman, where I think that at a certain point we discount the summer enrollees and everything. But I think that if you look at the school Exeter came from, what their track record is, and then just what he was physically and how he developed through the recruiting process, I think that maybe we should have been a little bit more excited about him, what he can bring. But yeah, I mean, looking at him in that room, it is a bigger room than it was the past couple of years. You talk about adding Kyron Hudson. Lyric Samuel's taller, not necessarily bigger, but that adds another element to it. And even Kobe Howard is stoutly built, and obviously you can't forget Matt Outen. I think when you look at that room, Matt Outen is the one who stands out from that physical perspective. But I think Exeter, he just feels like a little bit of a kind of like a throwback, just because of how big he is, the bulk that he has. He's wearing number 80. Wide receivers don't really wear numbers in the 80s anymore. And so you look at him, and I think that you can start to put things together a little bit. I mean, I'm usually, like, my personal wide receiver taste, I'm always a sucker for that wide receiver who's like 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", in that like 215 to 230 range. I like what it was like Malcolm Kelly and Devin Thomas. I think in a draft a couple too long ago, I was enamored with them. Didn't really work out in the NFL. But I think that Exeter can do some different things for you. And I'll be excited to see how he gets worked in when he does see the field. I think hearing Josiah Brown's name was interesting. I think that's one where you're listening to Franklin talk and taking notes or thinking about what the next question can be, thinking about other things, and then suddenly you hear a name and it'll snap you back to it a little bit. And I think hearing Josiah Brown's name was that for me last night, because he's we didn't see him at all last year, only saw him in practice. We knew that he had a unique skill set and some speed that could be useful for this offense, but we just haven't seen it. And so I think that you talk about getting eyes on guys. He's a really important one, so that we can learn more about him, see what he can do on Saturdays. But I think it's a good sign to hear that he is, at least getting Franklin's attention.
Put together some fun high school film as a playmaker before that injury cost him his senior season. A guy that I didn't write much about him in my notebook last Saturday. I just wrote looks smooth, but I did notice him. And I guess, he's a guy that I didn't notice much last year. Clearly, he's making people pay attention now if James Franklin is mentioning him. Generally speaking, you got to spend some time watching this pass catcher group, tight ends, wide receivers, some of those transfers that showed up to campus at different points this year. Biggest takeaways you want to pass along here in the podcast about that collection of pass targets for the quarterbacks?
Yeah, Kyron Hudson had a nice moment when they were doing kind of short area quickness drills and catching the ball off of that. Higgins threw one out in front of him and he just speared it with one hand, just right out of the air. And James Urban, who's a senior offensive analyst, he pulled Hudson aside to give him a high five and tell him it was a nice play. We've heard a lot about Hudson from that leadership perspective. He was a team captain at USC. I talked to some of his former USC teammates out in Las Vegas, and they had really good things to say. There's one point where Franklin walked over to the wide receivers and, was offering a coaching them up. And I think a lot of times you just see the players in that type of situation, it's, just kind of nodding, or there's not like a big response to that. But Hudson was, verbally, affirming what Franklin had said. And I thought that was interesting to see from, a veteran, a new guy to this program, and someone that Penn State is hoping can raise the level of this group. So that was interesting to me. I think with the tight ends, Luke Reynolds, they were doing the drill with the big blow up balls where, they're rolling them and they have to get around them. Luke Reynolds just hurdled one at one point, and just to see someone, at his size get up like that and make that kind of athletically impressive feat, that stood out to me. I think Andrew Rapplier, still working his way back. You can tell he's still knocking off some rust after, not playing for so long, but the eagerness is there. That's something that, we've heard, that they had to pull him back a little bit, that he wants to be involved in everything. He wants to do everything. I think you can really see that in his approach. And I think when you talk about rehabbing from a serious injury, a lot of it is physical, but you also have to have that want to. There's a mental side of things that stand out too. One more note on Stan Drayton. An interesting coaching point that I saw from him was during that footwork drill, with the big not medicine balls, but the big blow up balls and moving things around. He was, telling guys to be creative, that in that type of setting, like try something new, try something different. And I think that, that speaks to an approach of, it's not just doing the drill, doing it right. It's using practice to try different things out so that when you can get to Saturdays, that you'll know if you can do something, if you can't. And so I just thought that was a cool coaching point. Like, it's not, I don't really think it's often you hear be creative from a position coach during a football drill. So that caught my ear when I was listening to the coaching points and watching these guys practice.
Well, we brought a lot to you on this episode. We have plenty more, though, behind the scenes at Lions247.com. We heard from Khalil Dinkins, the tight end. We heard from cornerback Elliott Washington, who had a fantastic offseason and is carrying that into preseason camp. We've learned a lot more about the cornerback room in general. We had Terry Smith as well. A lot of those notes over at Lions247.com, where I hope you've been also following our preseason progress reports. We've got 4 or 5 of them up already through the first 7 practices. So we're at a pretty good pace right now. And one of them was hyper-focused on one of those young cornerbacks, Darius Dixon, why he has asserted himself as a freshman to watch on this roster. Good example of the VIP coverage you're getting over at Lions247.com right now and what you'll get all season long. But enjoy this camp coverage. Hop on board, 50% off for VIP access over at the site. And Daniel, like I said earlier, Tuesday is our next trip to the to practice. That's as closely, as close as we'll get to practice visits. So that should be helpful for us. We'll bring some more to the next podcast. Thanks for your insight as always. And got a lot more work to do over at Lions247.com between now and that next episode.
Yeah, 22 days till Nevada. It's just getting closer and closer. And I think every day we all get a little bit more excited.
That's right. Well, stay with us at Lions247.com. Stay with us here on the podcast. A couple more episodes coming your way next week. For now, on behalf of Daniel, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions247 Podcast.